On October 7th, Hamas killed nearly 1,200 Israelis, a majority civilians, and captured 251 hostages. Israel's response was immediate. Its military launched a massive counteroffensive on the Gaza Strip.
Citizens of Israel, we are at war. The enemy will pay an enormous price.
This counteroffensive marks the beginning of a devastating humanitarian crisis in Gaza. On the 9th of October, the Israeli government imposes a complete siege on Gaza. Many gather in Rafah and are blocked from escaping into Egypt. More than 2 million residents, who have been under a partial blockade for the past 20 years, are plunged even further into crisis. Water, fuel, and electricity have all been cut off, worsening the food and medicine shortages. The UN calls for at least 500 truckloads of aid per day. Barely half will manage to enter the enclave. The 13th of October, the Israeli army drops pamphlets ordering Gazans in the north to move toward the south for their safety.
Moving more than 1 million people across a densely populated war zone to a place with no food, water, or accommodation, when the entire territory is under siege, is extremely dangerous and in some cases simply not possible.
A local resident sent us this cell phone footage of them trying to escape.
تخافوش على اليمين تعالي حج على اليمين يا حج. Tout le monde est parti. Regardez les morts. Même pas une morgue. Regardez. Tout le monde quitte l'hôpital.
Due to lack of fuel, many flee on foot or by horse-drawn carts. 1 year later, the UN estimates that more than 90% of the population has been displaced. The 27th of October, Israel launches its ground offensive in the north of the enclave and intensifies its fighting. In mid-November, the Israeli army lays siege to Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City, where Hamas headquarters are said to be hidden. Hamas immediately denies the claims. Medical staff work as best as they can, given the dire conditions. No one is safe from the bombings.
As you can see, the hostages were evacuated from this section of the hospital because they were in danger of being exposed to Israeli shelling.
Incubators stopped working due to the lack of electricity, forcing premature babies to be transferred. After a final siege in March 2024, the army officially withdraws from Al-Shifa in April, claiming to have killed 200 terrorists in what they called a precise operation, leaving behind a wake of destruction and dozens of bodies. Despite numerous attempts, only one ceasefire agreement was reached in November 2023. Some 150 Palestinian prisoners and 50 hostages were released in less than a week. But the respite was short-lived. The 30th of November signaled the end of the truce. 15 days later, the Israeli army mistakenly kills 3 hostages.
During combat in northern Gaza, the IDF mistakenly identified 3 Israeli hostages as a threat. As a result, the troops fired and they were killed.
After 5 months of war, the UN warns of imminent famine in the north of the Strip.
We've come to stand in line. There isn't enough food for the refugee camp. A plate of flour isn't enough.
While hundreds of humanitarian trucks remain blocked in Egypt at the beginning of 2024, the US, Jordan, and even France carry out airdrops over the besieged area. However, the operations lead to even more tragedy as some Gazans drown or are trampled as they are trying to access the aid. Others are even killed by packages crashing down after their parachutes failed to deploy.
People are dying for a can of tuna, which doesn't even cost $0.25.
On the 29th of February, a food aid convoy supervised by the UN triggers a riot. The Israeli army fires on the crowd. Gaza's health authorities count 100 dead and several dozens wounded. In May, the Israeli army bombs Gazans taking refuge in designated safe zones, drawing scorn from the international community.
They were sleeping peacefully at night when they were hit by a shell. They were just civilians.
Aside from frequent bombings, Gazans also have to endure unpredictable weather. After surviving extreme heat over the summer, they are now faced with autumn rains and flooding.
We all ended up with our feet in the water. The children too. The whole kitchen was flooded.
Although polio had been eradicated in the Gaza Strip 25 years ago, the virus reappeared last summer. In the last year, the conflict has claimed over 41,000 lives, including 14,000 children, according to the Gazan Health Ministry. 101 hostages are still held in Gaza, with 35 confirmed dead. The fate of the others remains unknown. Trapped in a conflict with no end in sight, civilians in Gaza are the main victims of the war.